I've already started my video.
I know.
All right, so this is Towards a Theatrical Jurisprudence by Merritt Leboff, Marettleibooff. Space, materiality, and the normative. Okay, it looks like this. I'm pretty sure I got this on Amazon. So we're gonna look at a few things in here. He starts with law, and he's talking about common law. So he says this book moves across unlikely fields, and its terrain might be unfamiliar in different ways. So a few brief words about law, jurisprudence, and theater. So the reason why this book is so important, because in this book, I have a whole series of videos over this book, how to do things with words, because sometimes doing is saying, and Austin calls these performances. In this book, Leboff, he does not call them performances, he calls them theater. And so I wanted to read some of this to you so that I think it's very interesting what he says about how law is like theater in a lot of ways. But he says not performance, because performance is different than theater. So for this book, keep in mind that we talked about types of words. Let's go over some types of words real quick. And the types of words go with the type of actor. So if an actor has a certain type of part, he will say certain types of words, but he won't say other types of words. So we have, what types of words do we have? So we have verdictives. So a judge or a referee, an umpire, a jury might give a verdict, and these verdicts are rules. They describe, they find as a matter of fact, they convict, they acquit, they hold. Okay, so they tell you a player's out. And these verdictives are like a verdict. And then when a judge is in a capacity as giving a verdict, he's in one capacity, but then he has the power to execute, which means now he's going to go from being a judge given a verdict to now being a judge in his using his power to enforce the verdict that he just did, which then he's going to use exercitives. So exercitives are things like the president or legislatures would write in their laws, or the president in his orders, where they have the power to write laws or enforce laws, which also the judge does when he is enforcing his verdict. So exercitives are like order, sentence, levy, choose, bequeath, warn, pray, pardon, which is a presidential. So the powers that are in the Constitution, the legislative powers, the presidential powers, the judicial powers, they're lined out the way they are because they have certain things that they have to do and certain ways to bring about those things. And so they use those powers, and they use certain words of power to make things happen, to express their power. So then we have commissives, covenant, like a promise. Things that we see in contracts are commissives. Contract is one of the words. Bind myself, promise, undertake, to determine to, that I mean to, that I propose to. On traffic tickets, it says here, I hereby promise to appear, whatever. Okay, so then we have behavatives. These are words that go along with culture, with our society's norms, with religion, our rituals, traditions, and that kind of thing. And then we have expositives, to expose. So words that we use when we're exposing something. Okay, so that is Austin, what he says in his book. And then we have Leiboff, I'm probably mispronouncing his name. Okay, so let's see what he says. And he has some interesting things that he says about common law also. So if you're interested in common law and jurisprudence and what the word means and how it's theatrics and stuff like that, then you want to pay attention. So law. The law referred to in this book is common law, which originated in England and spread to its former colonies, including Australia, which is where the man's from. Common law is not just code or legislation. It's made up of a complex of elements that were shaped through case law, judge-made law, over the centuries, and continue to develop as new cases come before the courts. Law is contained in these areas or judgments. As each significant case adds to the body of the common law, these are more than simply a decision or verdict. The cases contain an explanation of the circumstances of a case, and depending on the stage of the decision, might account for evidence and facts in order to work out what the law means in any given case. Cases that account for the findings in a trial will look very different from cases that are dealing with an appeal. Once an appeal case is decided, particularly at the highest level of the judicial ladder, its logic will be adopted as law, as well as deciding whether the case has been won or lost. These cases add to the body of judge-made law. Some cases explain what legislation means because legislation is made up of words and words are not always clear-cut, and so the meaning of the legislation isn't always straightforward. Legislation sits against the existing common law, which means that words that might seem obvious are pinned against law that doesn't appear in the legislation. Again, if you've been watching my channel, we talk a lot about words and what do words mean and how we're deliberately misled to understand what words mean. Let's see. Law adopts a raft of interpretive methods, techniques, and principles to assist in finding the meaning of legislation, including whether it is actually lawful itself, by drawing on constitutions as applicable and existing legal principles drawn from the case law that form the long-standing fundamental concepts that operate, ghost in the machine like, as a continuing presence in law, such as the rule of law, the limits of governmental power, and what have been termed fundamental common law rights and freedoms that are protected by a concept that has been developed by the courts called the principle of legality. What might seem surprising is that though as principle, known as the doctrine of the separation of powers, the courts are meant to check on the lawmakers or legislature as well as the government, so that power isn't held in the hands of one entity alone. This means that governments might be told that what they want to do might not be lawful or might be beyond the limits of their power. Cases come to us from trials, and though law is most visible in its trial mode, trials are rare in common law systems, except in criminal cases. Most law is not visible or on display, with disputes being handled privately or cases being settled or worked out before going to trial, while most other law swirls around us, affecting every aspect of our lives through what Andreas, I'm trying to say this name right, Philippopoulos, Myhopoulos, aptly calls the lawscape. Law is left in the hands of individuals by and large through the move towards the courts, though the move towards the courts usually happens through the intervention of lawyers who shape the cases that appear before the courts. How those cases are shaped and what the arguments they deploy depend on the lawyers themselves, based on the law that exists already. One of the most difficult tasks for lawyer is to try to open up existing law for reconsideration, and how the lawyer goes about that task depends on their approach to law or the jurisprudence they deploy. So now we're going to talk about jurisprudence, and then we're going to talk about theater. This bifurcated word, jurisprudence, this bifurcated word is a highly contested term used to refer generally to, here's his definition, philosophical and theoretical considerations about law, including techniques of legal interpretation. It is concerned with the foundational questions about law, from the nature of law itself to obligations that individuals have towards law. There are deep divisions between different types of jurisprudence when asking these basic questions, from those grounded in morality on the one hand, to bare questions of legal authorization on the other. We tend to typify those theories as their abstract nature and ideal character. Okay, what tends to typify those theories is their abstract nature and their ideal character. From theories of natural law on the one hand that are traced to Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and then through Augustine and Aquinas to theories grounded in the early modern move to rationality and political liberalism that presaged the analytical and positivist jurisprudences that it's instantiated bare forms of abstraction from the 19th century onwards. Added to the mix and critical jurisprudences that range from the material and social to the abstract and ideal, some of which took shape in the 19th century but were largely ignored by conventional forms of law until the late 20th century. The deep divisions between the different jurisprudences and multivalenced, but are multiple, are variety. But they play a part in guiding the courts when faced with difficult legal questions, and though often not overtly visible, are able to be seen in the reasoning found in cases if you know what to look for. And I've talked about some writers on the law, such as Constitutional Law as Fiction by LaRue, where he goes over several of these books, of these other books, where they go over cases where you and I, when we're reading it, we think it says something. And then when it's scrutinized and analyzed by scholars, linguists, or law students, they see that it means something completely different. In this book, all of these different forms of jurisprudence will appear, but the work of theatrical jurisprudence is grounded in the posterior part of the word. So posterior is the back or the end, a priori is the beginning. So a priori is the first, which is juris, and posteriori is the back, so it's prudence. So he's talking about the word prudence. Juris clearly invokes law, but it is prudence and its invocation of wisdom, good sense, care, and judgment that is the concern of theatrical jurisprudence. And what it comprehends will be rethought in the book. So to a related term, jurisography, coined by Sean McVeigh, Anne Genovese, and Peter Rush, that asks us to think of how law is shaped through the lives, times, and places of its bearers, and through the adoption of the term jurisprudence as an individual who bears that responsibility well. Okay, so theater, and this is the last section. It's small, it's this big. So stay with me. Theater is a place and activity that is known to most humans, but the term theater is used in this book is not to be confused with the literary form, drama, and the acting in or playing in plays. The invocation of the literary has been inherited as a mark of higher modes of thinking through tragedy and philosophy, through Aristotle's Poetics, or having a didactic or moral purpose to play. For this reason, tragedy in particular has been used in order to shape thinking jurisprudentially, as Hegel's engagement with Antigone, probably not saying that right either, in order to consider the scope and obligation of law. That is starkly different from theater's purpose. Theater requires nothing other than bodies and space in order to manifest itself. In 1968, the esteemed English director Peter Brook remarked, "A man walks across an empty space, whilst someone else is watching him, and this is all that is needed for an act of theater to be engaged." Okay, so real quick. Austin says that in order to do things with words, there's an entire performance that has to take place. So he uses bedding, marrying, christening, baptizing as his main examples. So marriage is the one he uses the most. I think it's because most of us are very familiar with marriage and the process and how it works. So he says things have to take place. You have to meet someone. You have to like them. They have to like you back. You have to agree that you want the same things. You have to go before people, have a witness, have a minister, say some things like I do, or I will, or I promise to, or with this ring I thee wed, whatever it is you say. And then you have to also perform the act of being married. So there is no divorce just because you didn't perform the act, but to have what you call a marriage, you have to actually play the part of being married. So you have to consummate the marriage, you have to, do all these things, right? You know what you do in marriage. So that he's comparing these two. So Austin says it's an entire performance. The beginning to the end, you have to act it. So if the legislators pass a law, you have to act it. If the president orders people to show, you have to act it. You have to go into the military, and then you have to act as if you're in the military. If you decide to go into the military, or if you're drafted. So let's see. So this brief aphorism, however, leaves out just how that occurs and the rich and deep work that occurs to make that walk one where that engagement happens. So if you're going to talk the talk, you got to walk the walk. In this book, the work of one of the most influential theater theorists of the 20th century, Jerzy Grotowski, will be drawn upon. His work was so influential that it reshaped the grammar and vocabulary of theater practice profoundly, so much so that 10 years after he died on the cusp of the millennium in 1999, a UNESCO year was devoted to his legacy in 2009. His creation of a poor theater as part of the first period of his work that he called theater of productions radically reshaped what theater would expect of its participants, actors and spectators. And so in theater, it's not just actors, it's also these spectators are part of the theater. So if the actors are doing a good job, the audience believes they're there. They laugh, they cry, they get mad, they feel what the characters are going through. So it's not just actors, it's spectators. So the legislature can pass a law, but then we have to act it. We have to follow it, and they have to follow it. If we say, oh, that's stupid, we're not following it, then can it be really called a law? So, and this book draws on part of that legacy in the book called Towards a Poor Theater. So if you want a source, Towards a Poor Theater, the book quite consciously draws on theater rather than the more radically inscribed performance, which is what Austin talks about, the performance. Inspired, it must be said, by Grotowski's work. The terminology of theater is adopted not least because the term performance is weighed down by a distracting overabundance of meanings, definitions, and scope. So he's saying that theater and performance are not the same, that theater is not so weighty. And Austin's book goes into performance and the exactness of everything and how something is done and how it's void and how there's questions about the legitimacy of something, even though it doesn't void it, it goes into a situation where people are just unhappy with it. So like a verdict, people can be unhappy with the verdict, but it doesn't change anything. Whereas when some of the performance is not actually performed, it voids the whole thing. So if a man and a woman get together and then they go through the whole marriage process and the marriage is not consummated, then the marriage is void. And that's what Austin talks about. So this guy's going to be talking about things that are less strict than the performance. So he's talking about theater in law. And so we're going to be going through some of that stuff. So stay tuned and like, share, subscribe, especially share, because it really gets the video out there and gets some new people coming in. And you can post this on Facebook or wherever you like. And we'll be going through some more books and creating another podcast on this book, theater. Okay, theater and law. All right.